Chapter 8 The Flying Kid. The Nation Beneath His Wings. As Charles winged his way eastward, he flew across a country whose citizens should have felt optimistic and happy. The national debt was lower than it had been since the war. The unemployment rate was less than 4%. Taxes were at an all-time low, and the stock market was at an all-time high. The chief business of the American people is business, President Calvin Coolidge had said in a speech 2 years earlier. Producing, buying, selling, investing, and prospering, and the public agreed. By 1927, everyone seemed to own everything: pop-up toasters, ready-to-wear clothing, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, wristwatches, hair dryers. Spurred on by scores of new inventions, cheap mass production, and easy credit, the nation had gone a spending spree. No longer did Americans identify themselves by their jobs, religions, or political parties. They were what they bought. Things they believed could make them happy. That year, too, the public saw a mind-boggling leap in technology. Americans could make an overseas phone call from New York to London, although the cost of $75 for the first 3 minutes, about $1,000 nowadays. Few ever did. A far more popular invention was the radio. Introduced at the beginning of the decade, the radio by 1927 was a fixture in practically every home. Americans marveled at being able to hear what was happening as it happened. Another marvel, the Hudson River Vehicular Tunnel, later renamed the Holland Tunnel, would soon allow cars to drive beneath the Hudson River. And in October, the first talkie, a motion picture with sound, would be released. Astonishing moviegoers used to silent films. Even America's drinking habits changed that year after a powdered, flavored beverage mix called Kool-Aid hit the grocery store shelves. So why was the nation glum? Most people could not have pinpointed a reason, but the decades earlier euphoria and rebellion had been eclipsed by a widespread neurosis, like a nervous beating of the feet, wrote novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald. More leisure and more prosperity, more dancing, more parties, more movies, and more distractions had not brought happiness. Instead, they had wrought a world that felt shallow and corrupt. In 1927 alone, 7 years after Prohibition was enacted, more people died from alcohol-related deaths than any than at any other time in history. Crime rates were soaring, so were suicides, and a sudden, sharp rise in divorce had made the United States second only to the Soviet Union in failed marriages. Obviously, cars and Kool-Aid, tabloids and talkies, dancing until dawn, and bootleg gin had not filled the country's spiritual void. Something else was needed. And then, wrote Fitzgerald, in the spring of 27, something bright and alien flashed across the sky. The long wait. Up to now, the name Charles Lindbergh had been mentioned only briefly in the nation's newspapers, and despite Atlantic fever, no one had bothered to run a photograph of him or his plane. His arrival on Long Island on May 12th, 1927 changed all that. As the Spirit of St. Louis rolled to a stop on the muddy runway at Curtis Field, newspaper photographers rushed toward the plane, shouting and pushing, while a line of heavy motion picture cameras mounted on tripods swiveled to follow its every move. Blinking, Charles stepped from the cockpit. One of the reporters tossed out a question. "When are you going to take off for Paris?" "My engine needs servicing, and I'm having new compasses installed," he replied. "After that's done, I'll take off as soon as the weather clears up." It had been raining for weeks in New York, turning the airfield slick with mud. Puddles spread across the pass between the hangars. But it was the weather over the Atlantic that concerned Charles. The entire route was blocked with fog, snow, and sleet. "How's about letting the camera boys get a picture of you in front of the plane?" came a request. With difficulty, the reporters cleared enough room for Charles to take his place next to his plane. As they'd asked, he placed his hand on its propeller. The press saw it immediately. Standing there, modest and wholesome and smiling shyly, the flying kid was special. There was something old-fashioned and heroic about his attempt to make the perilous journey alone. And he was so handsome. Even better, he was an everyman, young, seemingly ordinary, middle-class Midwestern, the kind of person their readers thought they knew. Journey alone. And he was so handsome. Even better, he was an everyman, a young, seemingly ordinary, middle-class Midwesterner, the kind of person their readers thought they knew. This kid was a headline grabber, dubbing him Lucky Lindy, a nickname that he would always detest, but that reporters thought pithy and memorable. They turned the spotlight of publicity spotlight of publicity on him. And so it was that overnight the previously unknown airmail pilot from Missouri became the country's favorite flyer. His competition, however, believed Lindbergh was outclassed and didn't stand a chance, especially against the likes of them. For weeks the airfield had swarmed with flyers and mechanics testing and perfecting the two other planes that would attempt the flight. Commander Byrd's rebuilt Fokker and Chamberlain, and Levine's repaired Blanca. Like Charles, these pilots kept a close eye on the weather. Each intended to be the first to take off. The morning after Charles's arrival, Commander Byrd dropped by the Spirit's hangar. Still with a cast on his arm, the famous pilot clapped the younger man on the back and promised to help any way he could. He began by offering to share his private weather reports. Even more generously, he gave Charles use of his runway at Roosevelt Field, right next door to Curtis Field. Byrd had leased the airstrip for his exclusive use. Including its longer, smoother, and therefore safer runway. To his credit, the admiral insisted all his competitors use it. Over the next few days, Chamberlain also showed up at the Spirit's hangar, along with other big names in aviation. One of them was Harry Guggenheim, a fabulously rich ex-Navy pilot who administered a fund that promoted aviation. Like Byrd, he worried about the young pilot. Without a radio, this fellow would not ever make it, Guggenheim said to himself. He's doomed. Still, he masked his fears and tried to sound positive. When you get back, look me up at the funds office, he told Charles. Days passed, and the atmosphere at the airfield grew more and more tense. Pinned down by the weather, Charles went to Coney Island one day along with two publicists from the Wright Corporation, Dick Blyth and Harry Bruno. The Seaside Brooklyn amusement park relaxed the 25-year-old. He munched on popcorn and hot dogs, played some carnival games, and splashed down the chutes. The park's famous water ride. He was happy as a kid, recalled Blyth. Suddenly, a woman recognized him. She started sh- she started shrieking his name. "Get me out of here," said Charles. The the three men hightailed it back to Long Island. Not that he had any more privacy there. Every day crowds arrived at the airfield in hopes of catching a glimpse of the pilot who was on the front page of every newspaper. The Sunday after he arrived, 30,000 people descended on Curtis Field, as many as would attend a Yankees game, and reporters never stopped badgering him for interviews. When he agreed, they wasted his time with questions like, "What's your favorite pie? How do you feel about girls? Do you carry a rabbit's foot?" He found it embarrassing and intrusive. What did any of that have to do with his flying? With flying. In the middle of his frenzy, on May 14th, Evangeline arrived to wish him a safe journey. It should have been a private moment between mother and son. Instead, reporters surrounded them. Standing stiffly side by side, the Lindberghs endured a barrage of thoughtfulness, of thoughtless and insensitive questions. Did Evangeline know what a dangerous trip her son was undertaking? Wasn't she afraid he'd be killed in the attempt? It wasn't until they demanded that Evangeline kiss her son farewell that she balked. Her mother and son never kissed. Instead, she patted Charles on the shoulder and said, "Well, son, goodbye and good luck." The next morning, newspapers found the next morning newspapers featured a photograph of the Lindberghs' faces spliced onto the bodies of two people hugging. Charles wasn't surprised. Accuracy, he'd learned, was secondary to a newspaper's circulation. But accuracy means something to me. Every aviator knows that if mechanics are inaccurate, aircraft crash. If pilots are inaccurate, they get lost, sometimes killed. In my profession, life itself depends on accuracy. Thursday, May 19th, dawned gray and rainy again. Charles paced the hangar floor. Every minute he remained on the ground seemed to suck his attention away from flying. My problems are already shifting from aviation to reporters, photographers, and requests for autographs, he grumbled. That night, Charles drove into New York and with Blythe and Bruno to see a Broadway show. On the way, he decided to check the weather reports again. It didn't seem likely the forecast had changed. A misty rain was falling and the tops of skyscrapers were buried in fog. Still, he pulled over to the curb and Blythe ran into an office building to call the meteorologist. Minutes later, he was back, and Charles could tell by his expression he had good news. Weather over the Atlantic is clearing, he cried. It's a sudden change. Charles turned the car around. He wouldn't be able to take off tonight. The plane had to be fueled first. A tedious process that involved filtering all 450 gallons of gas through cheesecloth to clean out impurities. Besides, the skies over New York were still too thick without haze. Too thick with haze. But he could be in his cockpit ready to take off at dawn if one of the other pilots didn't beat him to the runway. Back at the airfield, he was surprised to find no lights burning in either Bird's or Chamberlain's hangar. He soon discovered why the other pilots were waiting for confirmation of the weather report. After all, there were only indications of a clearing sky. It was the opportunity he'd been hoping for. With his mechanics, he began readying the Spirit for the flight, filling gas tanks and making last-minute checks of instruments. After working until almost midnight, Charles, who'd already had a long day, left for his hotel. He needed some sleep. After posting an acquaintance, George Stump, outside his door so no one would disturb him, Charles let his head sink into the pillow, but sleep evaded him. His mind was spinning. What if there were still patches of fog tomorrow? Should he cancel the takeoff? No, a pilot should never turn down a break in the weather. But what if he was too tired to fly? Earlier he'd calculated that it would take him about 36 hours to fly to Paris. Did he have the reserves to fly that long without sleep? He believed so. He'd done it on the mail run. Nonetheless, he thought, a pilot should be fresh for the start of a record-breaking transoceanic flight. Your mind doesn't work as well when it's short of sleep. Stump burst into the room. interrupting his thoughts. "Slim," he wailed, "what am I going to do when you're gone?" Charles must have thought this a strange question, considering the two had known each other only a week. "Good Lord!" he exclaimed in exasperation. "I don't know. There are plenty of other problems to solve before we think about that one." With any luck, tomorrow he'd be well on his way to Paris. And tonight, obviously he wasn't going to get any sleep. He might as well return to the airfield. It was 3 a.m. when he arrived at the hangar. Somehow, reporters had heard about his planned departure. They were already there, shouting questions. But Charles ignored them. He looked up. The weather was still bad, but getting better. He felt the wind, a gentle headwind. He tested the ground. It was muddy and soft. These were definitely not the conditions he would have chosen. His mechanics, still fueling the plane, turned to watch him. What would he do? If the weather was too bad, he could always turn back. He told himself there was no shame in that. But did the Spirit have enough power to get off the ground? He was asking her to lift thousands of pounds in mist off a mud thick runway. Wind, weather, power, load. The words went around and around in his mind. Then his thoughts quieted. Conviction surged through him. He nodded to the men. "I'll start at daybreak. Take off at 7:40 a.m. on Friday, May 20th, 1927. Charles Lindbergh climbed into the Spirit of St. Louis's snug-fitting cockpit. After buckling his safety belt, he pulled on his leather flying helmet and adjusted his goggles over his eyes. Then he signaled to a mechanic to spin the propeller. The plane's engine coughed and gave 3 sharp explosions from its exhaust stacks before finally catching. "It's the weather!" the mechanic hollered to Charles through the cockpit's side window. Planes never rev up on a day like this. Charles leaned against the window and looked through the propeller's whirling blades. The long runway, shimmering with puddles, stretched out before him. At its end, he noted a parked tractor and, higher up, the twist of telephone wires. Beyond them, a thick curtain of mist shut off all traces of the horizon. Along with the usual mob of reporters and newsreel crews, the other airmen and their teams had come out to watch his takeoff. One of them, a representative of the Fokker Company, had driven his sedan loaded with fire extinguishers to the other end of the runway. This was where Rene Fonck had crashed 9 months earlier. Scorch marks still marred the spot. Charles signaled to the men to remove the blocks in front of the plane's wheels. The Spirit was free. He eased the throttle wide open. A soft runway, an overload of weight, and a wind that had changed from head to tail. 5 miles an hour tail, exclaimed Charles. Would the plane lift? The plane crept heavily forward. It wasn't vibrant with power like before. He could feel its great weight pressing its tires to the spongy ground. Great weight pressing its tires into the spongy ground. He could sense the fragility of its wings and the fullness of its oversized tanks of fuel. Nothing about my plane has the magic quality of flight, he thought. Gradually, the Spirit picked up speed. But half the runway had already passed beneath them before he finally felt the load shifting from wheels to wings. He had to make a decision. Should he close the throttle and abort the takeoff, or could he really get airborne? Is there still time, still space, he wondered. The wrong decision would mean a fiery crash. Charles eased the stick forward. They were almost at flying speed. The plane was so close to lifting. The Spirit rose. And dropped back to the ground. Charles tried again. In his hand, the controls felt taut, alive, straining. The plane rose clumsily. 5 feet, 20, 40. The telephone wires loomed straight ahead. Clarence Chamberlain clamped his hand to his mouth, then shouted with relief when, swoosh! The spirit cleared the wires with just 20 feet to spare. My heart was in my throat, said Chamberlain. It seemed impossible. It took guts. Later, people who witnessed the takeoff would claim Charles Lindbergh willed his plane into the air. Commander Byrd raised his hand in farewell. God be with him, he said. The official recorded takeoff time was 7:52 a.m. The spectators watched in silence until the spirit of St. Louis disappeared into the mist. In Detroit, Evangeline Lindbergh received a telegram from Dick Blyth. Her son had taken off an hour earlier and was now on his way to Paris. Evangeline who was teaching school that day, stuck to her normal routine until reporters showed up. Surrounding her during her lunch break, they clamored for a statement. Instead, she simply went home to the tall brick house she shared with her brother. Not until she reached her front porch did she turn and face the crowd in the yard. My heart and soul is with my boy on his perilous journey, she said simply. Then she went inside and closed the door. She would not come out again until she'd heard from Paris.